What is a nutritional psychiatry?
It is really the use of healthy whole foods and nutrients to improve mental well-being alongside traditional therapies. Medications have certainly saved the lives of many of my patients, but I don't think it's the only solution. And as I've evolved in my career, nutrition has really played a role in understanding a person's lifestyle, metabolic health, and also a way to really help them feel emotionally fit.
Okay, Dr. Uma Naidoo, what a treat. Thanks for being with me today.
Thanks, Jeff, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, next time I hope you can stay for a few more days in Los Angeles.
I would love to. Love this area.
So you've been called a triple threat, so you're a chef. Maybe we'll hear about some of your wonderful recipes. But you're best known as a nutritional psychiatrist. And for those of us who are unfamiliar with that term, maybe you could unpack, what is a nutritional psychiatrist?
You know, Jeff, it's a nascent and emerging field in psychiatry, and it is really the use of healthy whole foods and nutrients to improve mental well-being alongside traditional therapies like psychotherapy, which I still feel the different types are super important, as well as the use of medications. Medications have certainly saved the lives of many of my patients. But I don't think it's the only solution. And as I've evolved in my career, nutrition has really played a role in understanding a person's lifestyle, metabolic health, and also a way to really help them feel emotionally fit.
And you see patients.
I do see patients, and I continue to learn from them. I feel the integration of clinical work as well as the research is key, because you can't just do an important study and not see the effect on a patient. And I think that has been very important in my career.
Yeah. I mean, you give a lot of anecdotes in your book about specific patients that you see, and having that hands-on experience and seeing how alterations to diet protocols, I don't know if we really want to call it diet necessarily, but how one can introduce and remove different foods can have a significant impact on one's mental state. And I want to probe that with you.
Yeah, you know, they certainly do. I think that the way that I like to portray it to patients is that there's so many foods they can add to feel better. And as we add food, they feel a greater sense of abundance than restriction. And then we start to cut back on the bad players in the diet that they could actually be replacing with healthier versions. And I think it's key because a lot of, you mentioned, diet, and a lot of people think when they hear that word, it's restrictive, and food cannot taste good, and I think that often puts people off. Yeah,
well, I'm not sure that the diet culture has really worked.
It has not worked.
I mean,
and it continues to fail.
Yeah, I read some figure that 80% of Americans are on a diet, yet year over year we continue to see increases in metabolic dysfunction or metabolic syndrome and obesity, et cetera. So I'm not sure that diet culture is working. Yeah. And you do such a fantastic job at illustrating how, we can still have this very vibrant relationship with food.
Yes.
But that also loves us back, right?
Correct. I love how you said that. It loves us back. And we learn in small and steady ways, the small tweaks that we can make to just to feel better. I had this great example recently. I had presented as a keynote at a conference in the UK last year. And one of the doctors came up to me and said, after I heard your talk last year, I learned such an important fact that I didn't know how to interpret the amount of sugar in my food, because I looked at food labels and I couldn't understand that 4 grams of sugar was 1 teaspoon.
Right.
But when you gave examples and you called out, fruited yogurt, whether it's a dairy version or a non-dairy or plant-based version of yogurt, I hadn't thought about that. And so I switched my yogurt to plain, and I stopped eating the cakes and cookies in the office. Even though they were there, I just thought, let me see what happens without these. And he lost close to 8 to 10 pounds over the year, simply only doing that.
Amazing.
Not doing anything. I mean, regular exercise and things like that. But he said just cutting out that amount of sugar that I'd been eating in the office and switching my yogurt were very powerful. So I think it's about those little tweaks you can make without feeling deprived.
Yeah. And, we often associate vicious cycles with downward spirals.
Yes.
But there can be sort of upward positive spirals too.
There can be many positives. True.
And sometimes those come from just, little itty bitty increases in basal metabolic rate or losing 5 to 6 pounds, or just making little tweaks.
Yeah.
And then you're setting yourself up for a positive upward spiral. And that's obviously, it sometimes feels maladaptive in the short term, but long term, very, very adaptive. One thing that I just want to remark about you in general, and then we'll get into gut-brain connection and all the juicy stuff, is that I really am an admirer of your approach, because you are not sensationalist about your content. You are stringent and rigorous about the research. You cite a lot of studies and research. And you're also not fundamentalist about certain approaches. So like you said, there might be some cases where maybe benzodiazepines is appropriate, or maybe SSRIs are appropriate. But obviously, in conjunction with cognitive behavioral therapy or other forms of talk therapy, and then obviously food protocols, et cetera. So you're very open-minded. You're willing to value a lot of different approaches. So I really do appreciate that, because we live in a world where sometimes sensationalism is rewarded and wins. So,
well, thank you for saying that, Jeff. I've discovered through my own process and growth that some of my spirit of wanting to always include people also comes from something we talked about offline before we started, which is that I grew up in apartheid in South Africa. And I learned at a very early age, and it's taken many years to work through that in my own therapy, what it is like to be excluded on the basis of things like your skin color or your culture. And one of the things that really helped me grow from that, positive sort of traumatic growth from that, is never make people feel excluded. So even though I was raised in a Hindu family that's entirely vegetarian, as a chef, I cook anything. I had my chef instructors yell at me a lot, but until they tasted my food and realized I had figured out a way to measure ingredients that I would get, over practicing it, would get it right. But part of that comes from never wanting people, even on account of what they eat. So people will say, well, do you only advocate for plant-based diet? I personally am plant-based, but not everyone with a mental health condition wants to only eat plant-based food. So you have to adapt the nutritional elements to that person. And for me, it comes from that deep-set experience of feeling excluded from, in a country that really didn't recognize my color or my culture. And so I feel that's important to help people feel human despite any mental health issues they may be having.
That's a beautiful thought. As we were discussing before we got in, we share a mutual love for South Africa. Yeah. You grew up there. I spent 3 months there when I was 17.
Yes.
And got to enjoy a variety of different cuisines there. And obviously Indian cuisine is such a big part of that culture.
It is. And the town that I come from, the city that I come from, is known for blending their own spices, all obviously originating in India and having been brought over and recipes and all of that. But it's really known for that. And that's one of the reasons as well that I speak so much about spices in the book, is that it's an overlooked ingredient in what we eat.
Well, we'll get into turmeric and curcumin, hopefully, and saffron, because these spices seemingly have a very big impact on our mental health.
They do. They really do.
Okay, so you're a psychiatrist, but you're a nutritionist, which to me suggests that you're interested in the brain and the function of the brain, but you're also just as interested in the function of the gut. So we've typically separated those things in Western medicine. We tend to silo how we look at different systems and organ systems of the body. But obviously, you see the brain and the gut as connected, and science has started to prove that out. So can you elaborate a little bit on what's that bidirectional communication look like? What are the different highways, if you will, between the brain and the gut?
It's a great question, because part of it is that mental health is really evolving in the direction of helping us understand it's not an above the neck concept, and the ongoing research around the gut-brain connection has really helped us. Because the gut and brain originate from the exact same cell line in the human embryo, and the two organs grow, divide, and grow apart, but then are connected by the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, which is a two-way superhighway, allowing for, I like to tell people, kind of like teenagers text each other all the time. These two systems just are sending these text messages in the form of chemical messages.
I have 3 teenagers, by the way. And I have 3 teenagers, yes. By the way, so I'm very familiar with that metaphor.
That. So they continue like this all the time. It's bidirectional. So one organ to the other organ in both ways. But then you start to understand a little bit more about the gut, which is not only are these origins of these two organs the same, but 90 to 95% of serotonin, the happiness hormone, and the serotonin receptors are in the gut. And serotonin is also made there as one of the places it's made. So when you start to put these factors together, you realize that there has to be this food-mood connection when you think about the gut and brain. And then when you dive deeper, you realize there is that connection. And that is really one of the mechanisms that is front and center in nutritional psychiatry. There are other mechanisms still being researched, but it is something that I have seen clinically that makes sense.
Yeah, so there is an actual physical nerve.
Yes.
Where does that? Does it start kind of in the brainstem?
Yes, in the brainstem. Yeah. Exactly.
And so, just because I'm not a doctor, so I'm kind of feeling my way through it.
Of course, yeah.
So I assume that up and down that nerve, there are electrical signals.
Yes.
That are connecting, that are making communications essentially between neurons, and so there's essentially communication coming up from the enteric nervous system.
Yes.
Through like neuropods and neurons in your gut that are sending signals to your brain. Like, for example, I think there's some neuropods in your gut that can send sugar and send that little signal up to your brain. And there's probably some sort of dopamine reward system going on up there, which is saying, give me more of that. Yeah, right.
All of that. Yeah. True. Yeah. And the enteric nervous system, the reason that the gut is called the second brain is because the enteric nervous system is the largest body of nerves and neurons outside of the brain. So, and what it does is it wraps around the gut. And so exactly what you're describing is hugely important because there are these real connections happening in real time between these organ systems and sending these very explicit chemical messages. And that's where the food that we eat as part of the digestive process starts to interact with these messages. And one of the biggest things in mental health that has really also come forward is our understanding that conditions like depression, anxiety, and even cognitive disorders, focus, energy, are related in part to inflammation.
Yep.
And that inflammation gets set up in the gut also. One of the reasons is the food we eat. Right. It's not the only reason, but one of the reasons.
So are you referring to foods that might degrade the tight junctures of the epithelium, for example, and lead to intestinal permeability or leaky gut?
Over time,
and lipopolysaccharides and endotoxin entering the blood system. The immune system says, wait a minute, these shouldn't be here, sends out an inflammatory response, and we can get then into a cycle of chronic inflammation, and then that can spread to the brain.
That's exactly right. So the way that I speak about it is, the food that we eat is digested and in part is involved with the gut microbes. But the gut microbes are of many different types. We study the bacteria, but there are archaea, viruses, fungi, protozoa, many different types. Mm-hmm. And when our food products are digested, so say you had a healthy salad for lunch with a clean protein, lots of fiber, colorful vegetables, delicious foods, lots of spices. It breaks down. The breakdown products usually form short-chain fatty acids, and that's what we want to happen because they have a positive impact on the gut. They're protective of that gut lining, the single cell lining, and those tight junctions, which are important. Because it's a single cell lining, you want those tight junctions to be intact. Yeah. But when we are eating, the sugar, the candy, the chocolates, not extra dark chocolate, but candy bars, and those types of foods, the breakdown products are actually toxic to the gut and to the gut lining, and they start to pierce those tight junctions. And it's exactly as you said, that's what starts to cause that leakiness and leads to bigger problems. And it also upsets the balance in the gut, so you get dysbiosis. Right. And, I see an uptick of symptoms when people make sudden dietary changes and a month later they're having more anxiety. It's pretty, it's very telling. Very telling.
Yeah, I've got to imagine in your line of work, you are seeing a tremendous correlation between kind of self-reported anxiety and depression and gut issues, dysbiosis and leaky gut.
That's correct. I often get referred individuals from gastroenterologists for medications, saying someone is super anxious. I think it's related to this condition that they have. I think they need a medication. And lo and behold, they walk into my office, and my virtual office these days, and I spend time unpacking the history and realize that, they've had a positive job change, gotten promoted, are now traveling more for work. So they're not eating home lunches. They're not packing food and snacks to take to the office because they're in airplanes, landing in different cities, going to networking events, drinking 2 glasses of wine a night, whereas in fact they were drinking 1 on the weekend with their friends when they went out for dinner. And the entire diet has changed because of lifestyle. Yeah. And it's not a negative thing in the lifestyle. It's actually a positive thing that the person is doing something better in their career, earning more money, and an uptick of symptoms. And it's not immediate. Although the microbes respond within 2 hours, the actual changes take time. So you don't see that inflammation set in immediately, but it starts to happen if you persist with that diet. And simple in that individual and individuals like that, those dietary changes of just going back to the basics of what you were doing all the time before you had anxiety actually work for them.
So this could be an overabundance of high glycemic foods, for example, or too much alcohol. Could also be overprescription of broad spectrum antibiotics, or maybe too many proton pump inhibitors, or
all of the above,
toxins, glyphosate. I mean, there's a lot of different inputs that can degrade the
fast foods.
Fast foods.
So fast foods. One of these individuals, because of lifestyle changes, was buying fast foods in the airport. Right. Running to get onto a plane, arriving in a city late at night, eating out of the bar fridge, candies and Snicker bars and things like that. Or eating bar snacks, again, processed foods, instead of the whole foods she had been eating. And a lot of those, for example, fast foods, French fries have sugar in them. The research and development, French fries have sugar in them. You don't taste it, but the research and development is a lot of money spent in that to make them hyper palatable. Right. And one of the ways where you start to, I know you haven't done this in a while, if ever, Jeff, but you won't go up to the window and you upsize your fries, and then when you get the bigger size, you actually eat the whole bag. Right. And you wonder, well, I originally thought I'd get a small, and I hear this all the time, but they're engineered to be hyper palatable, and so you start eating them and you want more. That's because of the sugar that you don't taste, and then the processed vegetable oils that are more cost effective for fast food restaurants. And they're very pro-inflammatory to the gut. So if that's what you're mostly consuming, you're starting to create that dysbiosis in your gut.
And these are like hydrogenated oils, like seed
hydrogenated seed oils, vegetable oils, which are frequently labeled vegetable, but often have a large component of, of soybean. Some oils include things like corn that are pro-inflammatory as well. So many people don't realize that because they're not thinking what the products are fried in. So.
Yeah. And so help me pull on this thread for a second. So let's say we talked a lot about the upstream causes of inflammation. Mm-hmm. When inflammation goes to the brain has kind of these microglia, right? So the glia get inflamed. And does that essentially downregulate neuron metabolism? And then that's what's contributing to degradation of the hippocampus or loss of synaptic connectivity or density? What's going on there?
It's many of those mechanisms.
Yeah.
I don't think we're 100% sure of which one is causing what. Mm-hmm. As you know, we also touched on this. Some of the belief around even the serotonin hypothesis has been questioned.
Right.
And I'm always cautious about sharing that because even though it has been done by good researchers, that doesn't mean everyone on an SSRI should stop taking it because there are other things involved. But you're absolutely right. There's this very delicate system. The microglia are involved, the neurotransmitters are involved. And the moment that the brain starts to get inflamed and we start to develop neuroinflammation, all of those cells are impacted. And so are their function, and so are the neurotransmitter transmission. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a mishmash of many things, but you see it and come out in the symptoms that people have.
Yeah. Let's talk about serotonin for a second because it's come under some scrutiny over the last year.
Yeah.
Clearly, there's been a massive deployment of SSRIs, Paxil and Prozac, et cetera. I know plenty of people that have experienced some relief from SSRIs. Mm-hmm. I think the number needed to treat is like 7 or something like that. So not everyone's responding to it, but some people do. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it seems like the modern science is saying that low levels of circulating serotonin in the brain are not particularly associated with mental disorders, depression, anxiety, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But serotonin does seem to play some role, but we haven't necessarily put our thumb on what that role is. Like maybe, like I've heard some people make the case that serotonin and its relationship to other molecules like growth factor is helping to essentially contributing to synaptic connectivity in the hippocampus, for example.
Right.
So there's something going on there, but we don't 100% know what it is.
I agree with that. I think that to your point about medications, for the first time in my entire career of more than 2 decades now, Zoloft went on shortage, which is sertraline, in April, May of 2020. And this was because there were so many new prescriptions for Zoloft in that time that there was an actual shortage. So whether it actually helped people or not, I'm not sure, because clinically, and even the research has shown this, not everyone responds. And it takes either so many trials or so many doses or so many different ones that it could be one of the things we use, but it shouldn't be the only thing, which brings us back to why nutrition and our metabolism, all of those things are so important. I think that we with serotonin, we can't throw out, the expression, we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We've got to understand it's involved in some way, and maybe as we research this more, we'll understand it better. And I always am fearful when there are really good research, quality research done, because the way that sometimes the media plays into this and the way that it gets published and shared, people panic.
Right.
This happened recently with the World Health Organization and aspartame, and they are potentially, they actually in a few weeks are going to be calling it a potential carcinogen. And the whole thing is that, when people hear that, there's a sense of panic. And I'm not saying people should be using the aspartame. I'm not saying that at all.
Well, you've made a fairly significant case against it in your book. So
I have.
Yeah.
But it's also sometimes the way something is conveyed.
That's right.
So I think the balance around serotonin is, like, to your point, we are understanding the mechanism. It is definitely involved. It's not the only thing that's involved. Speak to your doctor about, using nutritional measures in addition to tapering off a medication or switching your medication or coming off. Or if you're otherwise functioning, as large part of my practice, people who are functioning but want to look at an alternate way through nutrition to feel better and see that if that works first. Mm-hmm. If someone is actively suicidal, manic, psychotic, food can always be part of it, but it can't be the first line of treatment because safety is so important.
Right.
But serotonin is playing a part. Right. I don't think it's as major player as was thought when these medications were brought forward and kind of took over the world.
Right. Well, you talk a little bit about serotonin as it intestinally produced serotonin.
Yeah.
So, and in your book, you talk about the precursor of serotonin, the essential amino acid tryptophan.
Yes.
So what role could tryptophan play in the production of serotonin in the gut? And how important is serotonin that's produced in the gut, given that serotonin doesn't really cross the blood-brain barrier? Mm-hmm.
That it is important. For example, tryptophan is needed by prescription in certain countries. Mm-hmm. The issue is that it isn't easily absorbed into the brain, and it needs to be paired up with a carbohydrate. Right. So in my book, I kind of make the joke that, maybe it's the mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving that's actually creating the impact.
Yeah,
but tryptophan,
I like that.
Tryptophan
it gives me a good excuse to eat mashed potatoes.
It is important, but it crossing blood-brain barrier. One of the things that does happen when we say consume a lot of sugar and consume a lot of candy and sort of refined sugar, I believe we should be eating fruit and healthy portions of it on occasion, in moderation, and sticking to things like berries and lower glycemic foods, certainly in mental health, where those can cause weight gain. But we shouldn't be avoiding them. But if we're just eating refined sugars and candy bars and ice cream all the time, that actually is helping the transportation of tryptophan across the blood-brain barrier. And so when people say to me, but I feel good when I eat ice cream, yes, it's true. But it's also having it's not also having a good effect on your brain after that initial feeling. And that's why I usually say, comfort food is discomfort for the brain, because it's not going to continue to help your brain, and it can actually be damaging to the neurons itself. Mm-hmm. So
would you recommend supplementing with tryptophan? Or I think you can supplement with 5-HTP, but I think if you can supplement with I don't know what it's called, TRP or
you can. In all honesty, I believe in supplements. I believe there's a place for them, because I've sort of matured and understood over time that we do all have nutritional gaps. Even as if you try to be the perfect eater, you're going to have some nutritional gaps. Supplements do play a role. I personally think there are other ways to handle that, just making those adjustments, like I talk about in my book, around what are the foods I can include. For example, saffron is a great supplement because the amount that we consume in food is not enough. It's a few threads of saffron in a dish. So it's not going to give you the amount. And the studies were actually done using supplements. And it helps depression. So there's a good reason to try a saffron supplement. I don't feel that strongly about a tryptophan supplement, because I feel like people have other aspects of food armor that they can use, right, and try those first. Whereas there's some of those, say, spices and herbs and stuff, where it's worth taking the supplement because they have shown in trials to be effective.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the gut and what we should put into it. So maybe you could start with prebiotics or fiber, and what role does that play within this gut-brain axis?
So an overlooked nutrient in the United States is fiber, because most people are obsessed with their protein intake. And it's not that protein isn't important, but we overlook fiber. And fiber is found in plant foods, vegetables, fruit, beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains. And studies have shown that Americans are grossly lacking in the amount of fiber they eat. Yeah. Why is it important? Because it feeds the gut. So prebiotics are actually a form of fiber that nurture and feed the gut microbes. They need to live well and eat healthy, and by eating prebiotic fiber, which you can take as a supplement, but it's also available in foods like the allium family, garlic, leeks, onions, bananas, oats, jicama, Jerusalem artichoke. There's a variety of foods that you can actually eat, and some people supplement with, with other powders and other things that are bringing you prebiotic fiber. By doing that, you're bringing fiber to the gut and you're nurturing these microbes. So that is key in doing so. And I encourage us to do that because we're not getting fiber in other places. Then there are fermented foods. A really good study published in Cell in summer of 2021, done by researchers at Stanford, showed that by adding fermented foods to your diet, you actually start to lower inflammation. So that was a great reason to understand why we can include fermented foods. And every culture has a fermented food. So, why not tap into those and start to include them, acquire a taste for them, and start to add them into your diet.
Can you give us a few examples of fermented foods that we might want to eat?
Sure. So miso, tempeh, kombucha, kefir, which is a soured yogurt, just buy the plain version. Miso, fermented soybean paste. With some of them like kombucha, if you're buying it at a store, just watch out for the added sugars because it has that sort of fermented taste to it. Often manufacturers will add sugar or artificial sweetener to combat that taste. And so, sauerkraut, pickles, all of these kimchi, all are fermented. And what they're doing is these foods are bringing your gut live active cultures and therefore sort of feeding, they're feeding your gut. So these are important. And then things like yogurt with, plain yogurt, dairy or non-dairy, have these probiotics in them. So having those foods help. And then there are the categories of food like omega-3 fatty acids. And these, if you consume seafood, the mnemonic I like to use so people remember is SMASH. So sardines, mackerel, anchovies, salmon, and herring. So it's just easy to get these because when individuals don't have as much access to food and they can't afford a side of salmon, they can actually have canned salmon because you're still going to get some benefit from that. Canned sardines, canned anchovies. So these are options for people to get those omega-3s. But there are also short chain omega-3s, ALA, which are not as well converted in the brain, but they're still available. And you can take an algal oil supplement because it's found in sea greens and walnuts and chia seeds and flax seeds. So that's another big group to include. I can't forget spices, one of my favorite categories. And there's lots of options in spices and herbs. Those are sort of the bigger categories. But then I talk about leafy greens because people don't realize that leafy greens contain vitamin B9, which is folate, and folate supports mood. Low folate is associated with low mood. And this was shown in studies like decades ago. Yeah. So we've known that a while. So of course you build on that, but those are some of the foods to start to add.
Yeah, that's great. That's so helpful. I think it's also helpful that you delineate between prebiotics, probiotics, and then you mentioned short-chain fatty acids, which in some ways can be seen as postbiotics. So Correct. They're kind of metabolites of live bacteria.
And there's ongoing research around postbiotics, psychobiotics, symbiotics. It's really a growing and emerging field. Mm-hmm. I think the more that we can manipulate these through food, the healthier we can be.
Well, I mean, we talked about intestinal permeability or leaky gut before. Butyrate, which is one of the short-chain fatty acids that is produced when you feed your gut bacteria good fiber, it actually helps to maintain that integrity of the epithelial wall. So, so there's good reason there. It also seems to play a role in insulin sensitivity and lowering inflammation and so many other different systems. So,
it's a positive byproduct of digestion that we want to have versus those toxins that get formed when we are eating less healthy foods. The other thing is this really interesting study, but it was an animal study, and it was done, I want to say March last year, or published March last year, and it looked at CMC, which is carboxymethylcellulose, which is actually a food thickener. So you'll see it on foods that require some thickening agent. And the study showed that the CMC affected the gut microbiome and had an impact on the gut microbiome's ability to form short-chain fatty acids. So even though it was an animal study, what it is inferring is that when we eat those processed, ultra-processed sort of junk foods that have thickeners in them, we're impacting our microbiome through that mechanism, potentially. So,
yeah, I know you're not fundamentalist about meat, and I don't mean to throw us into a great meat debate. Obviously, there's plenty of protein, amino acid bioavailability in meat, taurine, choline. There's a lot of fine reasons to eat meat. In moderation, grass-fed, et cetera. But as it pertains specifically to the gut, and there does seem to be a preponderance of studies that associate consumption of meat with colorectal cancer, for example. There's this protein Nu5GC that seems that we lost the enzyme, some thousands of years ago. We mutated out that seems to create antibodies, cause an inflammatory response.
Right.
What is the impact of the consumption of meat specifically on the microbiome and the gut?
I think the research varies. I think there's a lot of talk about the breakdown substances and TMAOs.
Right.
And honestly, the research on that is mixed. The proponents who want people to eat meat very actively saying that those studies just don't pan out, and the opposite for those who are fully plant-based, arguing you're killing yourself and you're killing your gut and you're killing the microbes and you're damaging your gut by eating these foods. I think that, so let me suggest a little bit of my philosophy. If you consume meat, to your point, consume it in the cleanest form. Have it in moderation. Around the time that my book was published, we didn't have the updated research that saturated fats. There's been a rethinking around saturated fats, and in further things that I've written, I've been careful to honor that because it has changed. Not everyone believes it. You'll go to some cardiologists and they will still say to their patients, "You should never eat this, never eat that," and I respect that. That's their opinion. But you also have to look at what the neuroscience is showing. So I think that eat it in moderation. If you have a family history of certain cancers like colorectal cancer, you should be getting regular colonoscopies. You should be getting checked because that could be a risk. As to the mechanism, not 100% sure because there's varied research on that. And I'm not trying to get out of the question, but I am saying that in nutritional science, on any given day, I mentioned omega-3s, for example. A very esteemed colleague of mine published a paper, I think it was at the end of 2021, in geriatric patients, where it shows that omega-3s did not help geriatric depression. And this was a very well-done study. Does it mean when we take my patients off the omega-3s that they're eating or taking as a supplement? No. So there's always mixed data. So how do you interpret it for the individual? And I personally think the way forward is through personalization of things like nutritional psychiatry, which over the course of my practice in my clinic, it's gotten much more personalized and much more related to the person versus the general principles of eat this and cut back on that. There's some guiding principles to get someone started. But then when you work with someone on an individual basis, there's a deeper way in which you can really you can create that personalized plan for them. So if you eat meat, eat clean meats, eat it on, in moderation, and lean into plant foods because they are doing good for your body with the fiber, the polyphenols, the antioxidant properties, and anti-inflammatory properties. I will also say, just to add to the mix, I talk about antioxidants all the time. And we taught the first nutritional neuroscience course in Harvard this past semester. So we launched a course, and
it's about time.
Yes,
well done.
It's only taken us, Yeah. But not at the medical school, by the way. Medical school, we're doing some other things, but at regular Harvard. And one of the things I uncovered is, and I shared it with my students, I said, I want you to know I talk about antioxidants positively all the time, but there's this body of studies that show that antioxidants can actually be precancerous and actually start to cause certain cells to convert into cancer cells. And, just be aware that for the most part, these are healthy substances, but we don't know what we don't know. So we have to have that balanced approach to understanding if someone is eating meat and they have a family history of colon cancer or stomach cancer or other ones that they have been associated with certain dietary restrictions, they need to be careful, monitoring. No one is saying never eat it, but be conscious of the choices that you're making.
Yeah, and I think that this is the most exciting part of this era of medical science is that the opportunity for bioindividuality, for precision medicine, for people to take a lot of more agency over their own health. Because for generations, you basically generally saw a man in a white coat once a year, maybe, if you kept the appointment. And that was really your window into your own health. And, if you didn't get a call back, about your blood panel, then you just assumed that you were fine. But obviously we know with so many of these chronic diseases, they're progressive and they don't present right away. It takes decades sometimes for these things to present. And so now there's so many tools available for people to have more agency over their own health. I wore a continuous glucose monitor for 2 years. I wear an Oura ring. I religiously do blood panels. And those are available to consumers. You don't even actually have to go to your doctor for them if you don't want to. So I think this is we're in a really, really exciting time. And I think if there was any silver lining to COVID, and there are not many, but it's that people became a lot more curious about their own health. And for better or worse, did a lot of research. Sometimes the research can be a little dangerous because you're not always getting the most stringent sources. But I think that curiosity about one's own physiology, I think it's a great thing.
It's very empowering to people. And nutrition is one of those lifestyle factors, as well as exercise, outdoor time, wearing an Oura ring, finding a program that can help monitor your glucose on your own. These are empowering the public. And I think, I feel people often say to me, well, why don't you, if I mention the French fry story, for example, why don't you bring that up with the food industry? I think there's a place for that. We do some advocacy work at Harvard. We have a committee that has represented several things, and we have really looked at it from the education angle of physicians and how we can broaden bringing nutrition in as one of the things. And I say to people, I think there's a role, and there are people who are actually taking on the food industry. And all of that is good, and I support that. But in the short term, what can people do? For example, when they changed the food labeling, food labels, it was supposed to go through many years ago to have added sugars listed on our food labels in the US. There was pushback from many industries against that for many years. So I say to people, in the meantime, while some good people are working with the food industry, what can you do? And that's where personal advocacy, choices you make, voting with your dollars, as to where you spend your money, whether it's a medical test that you get on your own, like a lab test, that's pretty harmless, to get that and then take it and be able to interpret it with your doctor, or the food that you choose to buy. Those things are really creating much more independence for people and an ability to make choices that may suit their lives better.
Yeah, absolutely. While there is seemingly endless debate around the topic of consumption of meat, there seems to be very little debate about sugar, for example. Although carbs are often vilified, you don't vilify carbs. You actually have a more nuanced approach. You say, like, carbs are okay because carbs are fiber, but really what you want to focus on is low glycemic index carbs. Is that right?
Yes. So those with higher fiber, so vegetables, is a good example. The examples of fiber we spoke about earlier. It's the choices that people make. So in an individual who is, say, has schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and is taking medications that are potentially life-saving because they have active psychotic symptoms that need to be treated, and they're eating, sliced processed bread, as may be found in a group home where they live, residential setting. Those are the things I want to try to focus on and adapt and adjust. Like, what can we do differently here? Because those are the foods that are causing them to gain weight and affecting them to, moving on to developing metabolic syndrome. So it is the type of carb you eat, the quality, the amount, and little things, the nuances, like, you should eat fruit. But if you are on mental health medications, maybe stick with berries and the lower glycemic. Have an apple. Don't lean into pineapple and mango, some of my favorite fruit, but they are higher glycemic, So it's about making those choices, and you don't have to give these foods up forever. I'm just saying, get to a point of better health and metabolic health. Yeah. And, then be able to work with a nutritionist, a doctor, a nutritional psychiatrist to be able to eat the foods you want, but over time.
Yeah. I mean, oftentimes, like neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's has been labeled type 3 diabetes. Yeah. I've heard that quite a lot now. There was an interesting doctor, researcher named Ben Bickman, who's been at BYU or Utah, I can't remember. But he actually studies like hippocampal tissue, for example, and what he's finding is that tissue and those cells have developed insulin resistance. So there is some dysfunction in the metabolism of glucose in the brain. And I know Chris Palmer, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard, put out a book recently. He was on the show called Brain Energy. And there seems to be sort of mounting momentum around this idea that a lot of these psychiatric disorders and neurodegenerative disorders are an inability for the brain to properly make energy. Essentially, metabolism in the brain becomes compromised through insulin resistance. And if you kind of back up from there, through the overconsumption of sugar, which can contribute to insulin resistance. Also, obesity seems like it can contribute to insulin resistance. And then you have this hyperinsulinemia at the same time of having insulin resistance, but your brain also, which often really loves to use ketones for energy, but ketones can't really exist in the presence of hyperinsulinemia. And so, we get into these situations where, your brain is not able to generate energy. And it seems like the overconsumption of sugar may be at the root of some of that reasoning.
I think that it's definitely at the root, and it's not just pure cane sugar. It's the foods that get converted into sugar, like the sliced bread,
right,
or other foods that people don't
anything
realize.
That becomes glucose.
Anything that becomes glucose. So people understanding that becomes important, and I do think there's a huge role for how we interpret metabolic effects, especially in mental health. Dr. Shivani Seth, a colleague of mine, I opened and founded the clinic in nutritional psychiatry. She founded the clinic in pure metabolic psychiatry at Stanford years ago, and has been doing ongoing research in this area. And, I followed her papers and stuff like that, as well as the work of others. And I think there's a real basis for this. And we should be paying attention, especially in mental health. I'm just not a proponent that there's only one diet that works. And again, we're using a word that we don't really like, but one eating plan that works. I think there are elements of the Mediterranean diet that work. I think there are elements of what I'm talking about and hearing others speaking about more, which is meditation, and a very smart Harvard medical student called me out, Jeff, years ago as talking about something. She said, well, I hope, Dr. Naidoo, you're not going to tell us about the Mediterranean diet because, I'm South Asian and we don't eat this, we don't eat a certain type of food. And I think she picked on chickpeas. And it made me think, when you interpret this for different cultures, bring in elements of foods that are healthy that they can eat. So I think that was an important point. So I think use of meditation, which originally was looked at in the input of Japanese food, but if you widen that to Pan-Asian cultures, it becomes accessible to more people, and you also still including, say black soybeans, for example, or black beans versus just chickpeas, and that's of course one component only. So I don't think there's just one eating plan. I think it has to match that person and what they need. My initial work in mental health before I veered into nutritional psychiatry was in a forensic setting with severely mentally ill individuals. So individuals who were getting in trouble with the law because of mental health issues. And part of that really taught me the use of these medications and when they can be helpful and not helpful. Mm-hmm. But it also taught me that if you're prescribing these medications, you really shouldn't be feeding these individuals sliced white bread because it's worsening their situation. So how do you place them on an appropriate diet? Well, the hospital should be managing that, but we don't. Hospital food is terrible.
Yeah. Well,
for the most part.
Firsthand experience of this. My daughter just spent 5 days in the hospital. It's a whole nother story. But of course, I was very aware of the food that she was being served. Right. She was on IV for 5 days, so she couldn't really eat. But still, they brought in these, plates of food, which was like juices and processed cold cuts on white bread, et cetera. Yep. And I'm like, oh my God. And it's beautiful, well-meaning people, nurses and doctors in this hospital on the pediatrics ward, doing everything they can for the health of the patient.
Not looking at the food in most hospitals. Some hospitals are trying to do it better. Yeah. But for the most part, it's a huge gap because, the multiple stories of cardiac patients after surgery getting the most horrendous food, So there's a gap there. All I'm saying is that it's great that we have these guidelines, even the guidelines I speak about, but they have to translate into real life. And some of those individuals that I was initially treating, unless the hospital was going to provide it, they were going to go out and spend their money with food stamps or whatever they had access to on getting the most amount of food, which also happens, in the community. And I think it's hard. It's hard for people to know without a level of education or an intervention, the best choices.
Yeah, there's just multi-fronts on this. I wouldn't call it a battle, but on this, effort to reify a healthier food standard in the United States. I mean, certainly, like you say, there's a lot of individual choice and personal agency. Yeah. At the same time, there's not great access to healthy foods. I worked with a former congressman from Ohio, some years ago on trying to get SNAP, the food stamps program, to be redeemable online so people could go and use healthy food delivery services to bring healthy food to their neighborhoods where they might only have a bodega or what's called food deserts, et cetera. So unfortunately that we weren't fully successful in that quest, but I think there's growing awareness of these issues.
And that was a great effort, Jeff, because now I actually met with someone at a Milken event, I think it was earlier this year, and she works with Amazon, and they were able to get the SNAP system integrated onto Amazon.
Oh, is that right?
So now you will actually look at groceries on Amazon and they'll say it's eligible for being redeemable in this way or redemption in this way. And parents or families that are in areas that are where there's food apartheid can actually access these foods. So it's one of the solutions, but good thought to have had, because when you see people in these situations, they're filling their carts with the foods that they want to feed their family with. And the more food you can get, the better you feel. Except, what do you what's 10 pieces of food for $10? It's usually the right. worst food, unfortunately.
Well, in terms of meeting people kind of where they are, you enumerate a bunch of food swaps, which I think were great. And I have to refer to my notes here. So I'll give you some examples, and then you can tell me some good swaps. How's that? Okay. So these are healthy food swaps. So let's say you're a sugary candy person. What are some possible swaps for you?
Okay. So there are a whole lot of things going on with that, because you can go for, the purest approach and get plain Greek yogurt if you don't consume dairy, or plain coconut yogurt. Cinnamon is actually a great sweetener and has great sugar balancing benefits.
That's right.
And
glucose.
That's
sink.
Right. Exactly. And it sweetens. So you can add that and have it with berries. And by the way, wild blueberries have twice the amount of antioxidants. So if you get them frozen, I often suggest to people to do that. But you can also use frozen, you make your own frozen yogurt, add fresh fruit to it, like those berries, freeze them, dip them in extra dark chocolate. Why extra dark chocolate? Natural chocolate has a good amount of evidence for improving mood. It also has serotonin, magnesium, and prebiotic fiber. I'm not talking about candy bars, obviously. So there are ways can you move from the candy bar to a little square of dark chocolate and enjoy that with, say, something like a clementine. Because one of the things I learned in culinary school were two little tricks which really blew my mind. One was pairing citrus with dark chocolate. It actually is delicious. And another one is putting a pinch of black pepper when you marinate strawberries, just in their natural liquid. You're not adding sugar to it, because it just brings out the flavor. So just little things that, make it different for you.
Black pepper and strawberries.
A pinch of black pepper. It's a recipe in my book. And so it just brings out the flavor. You can always have a, zest of lemon on it or something like that. But ways to enjoy something that's sweet in a different way. And I like people to try to turn to just healthy whole foods in that way and pair them up with stuff, dipping strawberries in extra dark chocolate, not hard to do. And that just gives you something that feels like a dessert, and it is. It's just, it doesn't have to include. There's another one that I love, which is a banana ice cream, just made from frozen bananas and whipped into what ends up looking like an ice cream. And you can even make a chocolate flavor by adding extra dark natural cacao, and then you have like chocolate ice cream. And so the more that you start to try these things and expand your repertoire, the way there are ways that you can fulfill that so-called sweet tooth, but with better choices for your brain.
Yeah. And it's more gratifying.
And it's more gratifying.
Right? To make something that's delicious versus just opening a box of something.
I agree. I agree. And they're not that hard, because you're leaving out so much of the processed ingredient that it's, you're just a strawberry and you're dipping it in chocolate. So.
Okay. I'll give you another swap.
Okay.
That was good. So what about some of the more common vegetable oils or seed oils? What should we be using there?
So my preference is for people, if they can, to use, extra virgin olive oil in, say, salad dressings and things like that, and to cook, if they can, in avocado oil because of the, cooking it slightly, say, roasting vegetables, for example. I also suggest to people to use alternate cooking methods, like in an air fryer. Because an air fryer is a way to avoid the oil entirely or use much less. So avocado oil in that instance, and really get that crispy feeling to, say, zucchini fries or whatever it is, sweet potato fries, whatever it is that you like. Another way to think about it is there are also new oils on the market that are sort of very new, but I know this because people reach out to me and want to send me samples to taste that are not made with any of these. And so there are a couple of those out there to look for, as I think could be more emerging as we move forward as another alternative. I just want people to try to cut back on the processed vegetable oils as much as they can.
And I know there's been a lot of debate around like flashpoints and olive oil. Yep. Do you come down on any side of that debate?
So I feel like, here's the thing. For centuries, people in Italy have used olive oil, deep fried in olive oil, done everything with olive oil, and they, it's part of the Mediterranean region. They're doing okay. So I feel like with the knowledge, the small amount of knowledge I have, I prefer not to use that at high heat. Yeah. But if you do, it's not a crime. Just make sure that you using in moderation. I always say to people, I wouldn't want you to be deep frying all your food anyway. So use it for healthier ways to consume it.
Okay. The elephant in the room is often sugary drinks, like soda, but also juice.
Juice, yeah. So, vegetable and fruit juices.
So what would be a healthier alternative than sodas or unadulterated juices? Yeah,
this is often hard for people, and I want to just acknowledge that because they're used to having a sweet beverage. But between the actual sugar and just even a 20-ounce bottle of soda, which can have up to 10 teaspoons or more sugar, I think in a 20-ounce, I think is about 10 or more teaspoons of sugar. I always say to people, would you be adding 10 teaspoons into a beverage that you were having? Say it was iced tea.
Yeah.
So some choices are trying to get them from on a continuum back to sort of water and what do you add to water. This is where it can be a bit problematic because some manufacturers are now making zero calorie ways to sweeten these. Right. And I was recently asked to comment on a water craze that was going on TikTok. And let me provide this example to help us with this. Yeah. And the message was positive, drink more water. So there were young people getting on TikTok and showing these 40-ounce, jugs, for want of a better word, and drinking water. But they wanted to sweeten it to make it better. And one of the things they were using was a powder made from Skittles. So Skittles candy made into a powder was one of the things they were putting into these 40-ounce. And I was like, okay, so we're mixing this up a little bit. It's not quite what we want. We want you to drink water, but not in this way. Yeah. So water is hard, but citrus, berries, zesting lime, lemons, oranges, even using the peels to flavor the water. It's just one way to rethink it, making it interesting for people. I think that with juices, both fruit and vegetable juices, a little bit, you're on holiday, they offer you a nice freshly squeezed orange juice. No one's saying don't have it. It's more that we don't want you to have it all the time. And the way I like to explain this to people is not only is the fiber removed, sometimes if it's store-bought, it has added sugar. But then the other thing is if you had a quarter cup of berries and you had those same berries made into a juice, it takes you a second to drink that, but it probably takes you a few minutes to eat the berries because you're chewing, you're enjoying it, you're savoring the flavor. All of that is going into the process, and therefore it's reaching your bloodstream at a slower rate. But when you gulp that little bit of juice, it's reaching your bloodstream as pure sugar, even though it's from a fresh fruit. Yeah. And that's important, the difference in how it impacts your metabolism.
Yeah. I mean, I think, if you're going to consume fruit, try to eat the whole food.
That's it.
I mean, with apples, for example, if you wash it or get an organic apple. But if you leave the peel on and just eat it as an apple, you still get the quercetin and the pectin and the fiber and all of the other stuff. That's right. Versus juicing it or dehydrating it even.
Correct. So because dehydration can concentrate the sugars.
Right.
So it's not the worst choice or something like that. But you kind of have to pay attention to that if you are looking at your health. And that's where actually continuous glucose monitoring has helped us learn a bit more.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So probably you know her too, but a very, very close friend of mine, Dr. Casey Means, who's the chief medical officer at Levels. Yeah. She told me actually that the number one spiking food that they've ever tested, and they gather a lot of data from people's use, was Skittles.
There you go.
So,
Skittles powder. Well, but I mean, they were using powder in these liquids, but yeah. So I think, beverages are hard, but I talk about things like, clean up your coffee. If you consume coffee, clean up your if you consume
when you say
alcohol.
Clean up the coffee, just don't load
put
it
junky
up
ingredients
with yeah.
So in Boston we love Dunkin' Donuts, and I see people putting a quarter cup of processed creamer and ultra processed cream, and then 8 sugars. Yeah. So it's just something that we can. I don't say avoid coffee because many people like it, and there are actually some health benefits.
Right.
I think it's about how we consume it and then finding a healthier version. It's not easy if you're drinking several sodas to suddenly say, sure, drink water with berries. But can you start to embrace something that's a little different that's going to help you?
Yeah. While we're hovering on coffee and caffeine, in your book, in the chapter on anxiety, and I know that you have a bigger project coming on anxiety, so I want to make sure that we tease that out a little bit. But what is the relationship between caffeine consumption and self-reported anxiety? Where should we be there?
Yeah, so coffee has a lot of plant polyphenols and is healthy for the liver. A colleague of mine has written an entire book about this. But it's the caffeine that often causes problems for people. And with anxiety, it has become even another one of those areas that's become personalized, because I have patients who can drink a couple of cups of coffee in the morning, kind of, like I said, the sort of clean cups, without all the junky ingredients, and be fine. Others can't even tolerate half calf or decaf, and they get jittery. It's not for them. Some of the research showed that consuming less than 400 milligrams a day was okay. I think, again, it comes down to your tolerance and how you are consuming it and what the impact is. It's not a bad substance to drink. Clean up your coffee and have it earlier in the day. So if you're drinking coffee in the afternoon, I suggest switching it out with just a simple cup of green tea or tea with fresh mint, because mint contains luteolin, which is an antioxidant that actually boosts energy and kind of focus, as does green tea. Green tea has EGCG and L-theanine, which actually helps people focus a little bit. So I'd say don't go for that cup of coffee. It's going to actually keep you up at night. Have a cup of green tea or mint tea, even made with just fresh mint leaves, because that'll perk you up and give you a little bit of a boost to get you through that afternoon, what people feel is an afternoon slump. So I think with coffee, be careful. It can worsen your anxiety. And if it does, that for you is something you need to cut back on. You can have withdrawal from caffeine. So if you're drinking a ton of coffee and it's not agreeing, don't go from 5 cups to 0. Cut back a little bit slowly over a few days so your body can adjust as well. Mm-hmm.
So can you quantify 400 milligrams for us in terms of the layman? Let's say you're going to Starbucks. What does that mean?
Right. So, off the top of my head, I have to tell you, Jeff, I've forgotten. But in the book, I broke it down into the different sizes of, say, Starbucks coffee, just to make it more tangible for people.
I think I remember. I think the venti was maybe 420 milligrams, or a little bit above.
More. It was a little bit, and we're talking just about the actual coffee, not talking about the flavored and the others. Yeah, because like the flavored coffees and the additional ingredients, all of that it takes you in a whole other direction with the added sugars. But I have a fun question for you. So years ago, right, there was this really colorful drink that one of these coffee shops produced, and every kid was buying them.
Pumpkin spice latte. Or
right. So this one had lots of colors in it.
Okay.
So it actually looked beautiful. But so I did an experiment with some of my patients in my clinic, and I said, okay. I checked this out on the app, because the app allows you to put in, no sugar, whatever, different combinations. And I had them guess how many grams of sugar after they know that 4 grams of sugar is 1 teaspoon. Yeah. And a small size, the smaller size, the 12 ounce, without any added whip, without any added syrup, called non-fat, had a certain number of grams of sugar, and I want you to guess how many.
Oh, God. I don't want to be so negative. I'll say just 25 or 30 just for the...
It had 57 grams of sugar.
Oh, no.
So it was just a way to teach
57 grams of sugar. So that's your full...
It was basically full of sugar. It was, and the entire thing was sugar. Yeah.
And what is the recommended daily intake of sugar?
It's significantly less. I want to say the American Heart Association puts it at under I want to say 25, 20 and 25 or something like that. So
you're already with
that one drink, right?
You're already crushing it times 3, basically.
You're crushing it times 3. And the whole purpose was to teach them that they can look it up in an app and calculate it ahead of time and educate themselves that they can make a better choice.
Mm-hmm. Is there a good app that reports glycemic index?
So I was actually talking about the coffee shop app to calculate it.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of debate about glycemic index. Okay. So I think there are apps like MyFitnessPal that actually do help you track your nutrition and the breakdown of the nutrition which people like. And they have like a database of 14 million foods or something. So that's one that many of my patients, not all of them, but some of them that like to track may use. But there's several others too that they can use.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about how the gut influences the brain. I want to maybe just touch on a little bit of that bidirectionality and how the brain influences the gut. Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned in the book, and I think people have a sense for this as just a product of their own experience, is when they're in a psychologically taxing situation or they've got to go public speak and they're not used to that. They're assigning some form of salience or valence to a particular situation or its perceived threat or nervousness, they get a feeling in their tummy, right?
Right.
Like butterflies, it's often described as, it's a little bit of turmoil. So just as a product of direct experience, we know that psychology impacts physiology, that our brain and how we perceive the world has an impact in terms of how we feel in our gut. Maybe you could unwind the impact of psychological stress on gut physiology.
So studies have shown that things like, say, a bad day at work, an argument with a colleague, not having a good day with your boss or argument with your spouse, stressful situations where we perceive stress can actually impact the gut microbes within 1 to 2 hours. You may not see the effect immediately, but they are altering and changing, which talks to the powerful nature of those emotions being translated and helps us understand why other ways to feel emotionally better, by like learning a breathwork method, learning yoga, doing some practice that actually helps calm you, is so important, because the manifestation of the stress has an impact on your body and through the microbes. So, that's separate to all the other negative impacts of stress. The way that food can impact that is that stress actually precipitates habit pathways in the brain. So say you have suddenly developed a candy fix over COVID, and you wonder, well, why do I have to get that bag of candy every single day? Well, it's not only just sugar and the dopamine reward pathways acting in a similar way, like cocaine and other street drugs. It's also the fact that you are tapping into these cycles in your brain that get set up, and it's hard to jump off that cycle when you're in it. So there are many different ways that, the brain is the most important organ in our body. And I always say to people, we ignore it quite a bit, but it's without our brain, nothing else functions. So
yeah, well, it's mysterious in its ways.
It's very mysterious. We only learn. We're only learning as we go with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems as if the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the concomitant steroid hormones like epinephrine and cortisol have a negative, when it's chronic, seems to have a negative downstream impact on the gut and the microbiome. Is that right?
Yes, the hypercortisolemia that gets created, so the elevated cortisol, all of that has a very negative impact on the actual microbes and on the gut environment, the integrity of the gut, setting up for dysbiosis, etc. So I think that, the gut is I like to think of it as kind of Grand Central Station, because so much happens there. We have production of hormones, sleep and circadian rhythm, which is our internal body clock, vitamin production, immunity. 70% of our immune system is in the gut. mental health and how we feel emotionally, and so much more, right? So all of those hormones are interacting with these gut microbes. So when we're stressed, the cortisol response is hugely important and doesn't help us. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also know I believe the hippocampus has a lot of glucocorticoid receptors, so it's particularly susceptible to times of stress. And of course, this is the area of the brain that's responsible for learning and memory.
Yes.
And also in sort of assessing perceived threat. So it's in kind of a tug of war with the amygdala and the hypothalamus. And so there's, and when that becomes dysregulated, I mean, so many of these mental disorders and neurodegenerative disorders are associated, it seems like, with the hippocampus. So, we do need to really pay attention to stress and anxiety. And so are there certain praxes that you engage in or that you can recommend? I know your mom engages in some of them.
Right. I want to just admit I'm not a perfect person. I try my best, and I struggle like everyone. Cut
the podcast. She's not perfect.
Exactly. Because often people think, well, I wrote if I read the book that no, we all have bad eating days. So, but what I will say is. When I'm not in multiple time zones and traveling as much as I have been recently, I have a morning practice, and it involves meditation. I try to get something in that just centers my mind and grounds me. So in any particular order, I will have a spiritual practice, have a small meditation, make sure that I drink water, and I just find water very hydrating after you sort of get dehydrated after you've slept overnight. When I can do a sun salutation yoga, I'll do that. And coffee is part of my morning routine. I love a cup of coffee as I'm kind of getting up for my day after I've done that.
How do you take your coffee?
I often black, and if I, maybe a little bit of, actually, I've learned to make my own hemp milk. Oh. And so it's actually really creamy when you make it at home. And so I blend up a little bit for the week.
Nice.
So that I like black coffee, but I also like something in it. And so if I do, then I go for something like that. And it's easy to even carry around. It lasts a few days. So that's part of it. But I find when I'm traveling and in different places, like I have been recently, it's tough to keep that routine because you're not sleeping properly, you're staying up late. It's a challenge. So finding some way to recenter yourself is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's 60 million Americans now that have some form of mental illness or some self-reported mental disorder. We're talking about 23% of the population. I've seen projections that show that trajectory going up and up, even to 40%, 50%. So your work is obviously right on time. There are so many different diagnoses in the DSM and other places. Certainly, depression is a major one. Oftentimes what we're looking at is sort of clusters of symptoms to try to put a diagnosis on.
That's correct.
We know how to treat it.
And it's not perfect.
But we don't really know 100%.
Yes, I agree with that.
But certainly anxiety is such a huge issue for so many different people right now. And I know that you tackled anxiety in one of the chapters of this book right here. But you have a project that's more specifically focused on food and anxiety. Can you just tease that out a little bit? Because I know that book is coming out in December, I believe, of 2023. And this is right on time, like I said.
Thank you. It is. The inspiration for this book was really where the first book, This Is Your Brain on Food, was really outlining the different conditions and ways to handle them. Because one of the things that unexpectedly happened, because I didn't know COVID was going to happen as my book came out, was people had less access to direct care.
Right.
And food provided a way that they could really start on their own just to make these tiny tweaks and then wait for an appointment with a therapist or a doctor. But what I saw, Jeff, starting off with Zoloft going on shortage right at the beginning, first time in my career, was that people just had unbounded anxiety, and it was different phases. It was, the actual illness. It was the actual numbers. We was, take yourself back to March and April of 2020. And then it was the vaccine. Then it was, how many vaccines and is this, who's going to have a vaccine and who's not? And then should the children be vaccinated? All of these things. And then work from home, families, different generations coming back together when it was possible, or kids coming back from college. So many stresses. And what I just saw cycling in all of my patients was anxiety, just in people who had otherwise been okay, and not necessarily all related to dietary changes, just an unbounded anxiety. And I felt there had to be a way to focus in on this. And many people think of depression because depression and anxiety can be lethal, but depression is one of the global cause of disability worldwide. But anxiety is the most common condition in the US, and it's always been that way, and it has increased after COVID. Some of the research is pointing to 2 times or more. The World Health Organization globally released data to say that depression and anxiety increased by 25%. So I think that there's a reason we need to think about the ways we can tackle anxiety. And it's a plan. It's many different things, but one of the ways you can do that is how you're eating. And so my next book is called,
let's bring it up. Let's look at it.
It's called Calm Your Mind with Food. You're hearing it first here. And it really is about a revolutionary guide to controlling your anxiety with food. But it has the foods that, you should be trying to eat, the foods that you should be cutting back on, and more extensively going into the research, but then also a protocol. How can you work through this on your own? Meant to be not, if you're seeing a doctor, by all means, I want you to continue doing that, and your therapist. But can you do things at home in, really using the power at the end of your fork, voting with your fork, voting with your dollars about how you're eating and what you're eating to bring that forward. One of the most vulnerable groups has actually ended up being teenagers and young and adolescents, especially around the rising suicide rate. So I just feel that whether it's as a family, as individuals, as communities, as teachers, whoever we are, there are ways that we can do this together to just make these small changes that can potentially help us and be powerful. So.
Yeah, well, this is strikes a very personal chord for me. Obviously, I have 3 teenage daughters. I talk about them fairly openly on the podcast, of course, respecting their privacy. But I will just say that, anxiety is just so prevalent amongst especially teenage girls, but across both sexes. But I see it more in stark relief with teenage girls. And, I've also seen the teenage suicide reports and studies, and honestly, it's touched my girls directly, and this is why your work just couldn't be more important. So I want to thank you.
Thank you.
From a very personal place, and I just so look forward to getting this work out and amplifying it as much as we communally can, and anyone who's listening or watching this, please talk about Uma Naidoo and her work with everyone that you possibly can, because it's so important. And it's also, you just have the most beautiful way about you.
Thank you.
I'll butcher an Emerson quote, but who you are is so beautiful that I can't understand it. I don't hear what you're saying. You said something to that effect.
Thank you. That's so sweet. Yeah.
That again, you have a wonderful presentation, and is both inspiring, but also very informational. And as I said, avoids hyperbole and sensationalism. And I think that's what we really need right now. So thank you, Uma.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm so touched by what you said. And thank you for hosting me in this great podcast and helping to share my work with more people, including your daughters. I feel like they are some of the people I'm trying to reach with this book. Whether it's through their parents or themselves, this is it's a tough time for us, and I think this is one of our ways we can find forward together. So thank you.
Well, I'll be looking for you on TikTok as well. That's where they spend much of their time.
Except I won't be giving you Skittles powder. No, that won't be me.
Yeah. Well, when people are interested, and surely they will be, what's the best place for them to keep abreast of your work?
To follow me on social media, which is at DRUMANAIDOO. My website, sign up for my newsletter. I send out new foods and information and new research all the time. And we do that as well across platforms on social media, all the platforms. You can get a free chapter of my first book called, you can log into gutbrainromance.com and download a free chapter. And you can check out the book where books are sold, and you can look out for the pre-orders of the new book coming out in December 26th of this year. So
yeah, I believe the pre-order is available now.
It is available.
I did click through that, and I was like, okay, great.
It is available. Yeah, it's out there.
Okay, well, Uma, we'll do another one. I hope if you'll have me around the launch of the book.
I would love that. Book. Thank you.
Okay, to be continued. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.